Welcome into Metal Forge Reviews. I am Benfo. Today I'm going to be ranking the Novembre discography in December. Novembre in December. Yes. If you have any suggestions for ranking videos, definitely leave us a comment. Reach out to us on social media because we're very active on Facebook and Instagram. Let's get started with the rankings. So if you watched our video where we did the Death discography rankings, I'm going to be using a similar format. The timelessness of the album, the innovation, and the number of awesome tracks. So let's kick it off with Arte Novacento, 1996 on Polyphemus record. This record, Arte Novacento, was recorded and mixed by the legendary engineer Dan Swano. Novembre was still kind of working out their footing with this record. Sonically, it really doesn't hold up to modern production standards. The guitars are thin, the drums have a very 90s tone to them, which is, take it or leave it. And Carmelo's vocals aren't always harmonized properly, leaving him kind of sound like a bad singer. Some sections on this album just kind of fall apart, especially the really technical spots. I could tell they were trying to be innovative though, so I won't fault them on that. Here's a clip from their Depeche Mode cover, Stripped. So for timelessness, I'm going to give them a 4 out of 10. I don't really feel bad giving them this score. There were plenty of other bands in the late 90s like Tiamat, Opeth, Catatonia, Anathema, who were doing the sorrowful gothic metal thing just much, much better and tighter than Novembre. Some of the songs on here are just rough. For innovation, I'm going to give them a 5 out of 10. I can't fault these young guys and their wishful thinking to blend the vibes of new wave pop with gothic doom metal with some progressive flair, and you're going to see that as their albums kind of continue on throughout the discography. They have a lot of new wave sorts of influences, and it comes across really well when they do it well. The songwriting on Arte Novacento really sets them up for who they're going to become, but the delivery and the performance too often falls short, and that's why the innovation gets a 5. For awesome tracks, I have 6. So total score for Arte Novacento is 15. Next up, we have Classica. This record came out in 2000 on Century Media Records. And I just want to take a moment to dedicate the coverage of this album in particular to my lost friend, Nick Parenti. Nick was a talented musician, and he unfortunately took his own life in 2017. We connected over our shared love for all things gothic and doomy. He showed me this album many years ago, and I'm definitely grateful for that. I hope you're at peace, Nick. So only 4 years after the release of Arte Novacento, the band shows some considerable growth in their talents and songwriting abilities. Having the album kick off with screaming vocals shows a lot of gusto from the band that featured only clean singing on the prior album. Very, very few shouting kind of vocals. Carmelo isn't really the best clean singer, but at least he tries to write some really catchy vocal melodies on this album. There's a lot of restraint on this album, and that's something that I really admire about the band. They'll introduce this amazing harmony section or riff, play it for 2 bars, and then never play it again. I think a lot of bands would get trapped into repeating that part, or at least bringing it back into a chorus or something. But there are many sections on this album that are just kind of one-off parts, and I think that's really cool. This album is where they really let the bass players fly off the handle, and you'll see that throughout the rest of their discography, and it's absolutely brilliant. This becomes a Novembre signature, like I just said, where the bass player just does crazy licks, and I lose my mind over that kind of stuff. I love it. For those of us who love some really awesome guitar solos, this record has a bunch of them. Here's a clip from one of my favorite solos in the song, Tales from a Winter to Come. So for timelessness, I gave this album a 6. This is a standout album that is typically on very heavy rotation for me when I'm in the mood for Novembre. However, it is overshadowed in its timelessness by a couple of the other albums, namely Novembre and Waltz and URSA. For innovation, I gave this a 7. For their first handful of releases, Novembre is constantly building on elements that they introduced in prior records. They take some signature melodies, riffs, or tempos and recycle them to help create a unique but characteristic sound. Classica is a perfect example of that, as it takes elements introduced in the prior albums and ramps them up in both technicality and form. For highlight songs, I give them a 7. So the score for Classica is a 20. Next on the list is Novembre Waltz, released in 2001 on Century Media Records. I'm going to be shocked if this album doesn't make it to the very top of this list. This is bar none my favorite and most listened to record by this band. Some of you may have heard me talk about this record on my favorite doom and black metal albums to listen to during the fall. I talked a bit about what makes this album great for that time of year. Here's a clip from that segment. It's just spectacular musicianship with a vibe that feels very in tune with the changing of the seasons. It's hopeful, it's encouraging, the musicianship is out of this world, and I just can't say enough great things about it. The band took their upbeat, dreamy waltz sound and pushed it into practically supernatural levels of prog mastery. There's just so much going on in this album, but it's never too overwhelming or chaotic. I think on my fifth or so playthrough, I was able to really pinpoint sections in the bass lines or drum patterns that made me awestruck the first time hearing it. The whole record is really a masterclass in writing beautiful, dreamy songs with a technical flair. Here's a clip from one of my favorite tracks on this album, Flower. Before I get to my scores, just look at that artwork by Travis Smith. It's stunning and really captures the mood that Novembre tries to portray on this record. It depicts a child that is trapped inside the vessel of a suffering adult. Novembre's music on this record helps to communicate with that child that's inside us all and return us to a state of innocence and dreamlike wonder of the natural world around us. So for timelessness, I gave this practically a perfect score, a 9.5. I can never get sick of this album. It is Novembre's magnum opus. Everything they released up to this point was just waiting to become Novembre Waltz. For innovation, 8.5. This was their dream team as far as musicians go. The technicality on this album is stunning. All the transitions that they might have stumbled over in the first two albums are completely smoothed out. The only reason it doesn't get a more perfect score is simply due to the band's tendency to repeat the same old tricks. They tend to recycle phrases and melodic structures that they've shown off in past albums. This isn't entirely unheard of for a band that only has one or two people taking up on the songwriting duties. So it's not a huge fault, but it definitely keeps the innovation level from being a bit more perfect. Awesome songs, I gave it a 9, so the final score for Novembre Waltz, a 27. Next on the list is Dreams Desure, Wish I Could Dream It Again. Dreams Desure came out in 2002 on Century Media Records, and in 1994, the band recorded their first album, Wish I Could Dream It Again. In 2002, Dreams Desure was the re-recorded version of this album. This is a pretty unusual thing to do, but I'm kind of glad that they did it because Wish I Could Dream It Again is pretty rough around the edges. Besides the re-recording in a new studio and with more experience in their respective instruments, the band shortened a title and combined two tracks from this album to create Dreams Desure. The record really tightens up their technical spots and smooths out a lot of the wrinkles that were on the first album. Coming off the heels of Novembre Waltz, however, I can't help but feel like this was a release that was an attempt to maybe get through a writer's block or something like that. Like they were kind of trying to return to form and rediscover what made them a unique band in the ocean of other goth and doom metal bands. So before I score this record, check out a clip from the 12-minute epic Materia. So for Dreams Desure, I gave the Timelessness a score of 6. This isn't a bad album by any stretch of the imagination, but to have it come off the heels of their magnum opus really leaves me wondering what was going on. Why wouldn't they just keep going with the amazing writing that they were doing? Why would they re-record an old album? For innovation, I gave it a 5. It's weird to score this album because it's the first iteration of another album, and it helped to really define the Novembre sound. Many of the Novembre tropes are here in spades, but it's weird to me that they'd revisit these old songs so quickly. Not even a decade has gone by, and they re-recorded an album. Some of the songs on Dreams Desure sound too similar, and I almost wish they had chosen a few songs to re-record and maybe put them on an EP or something like that. In awesome songs, I gave it a 6, so the total score for Dreams Desure is 17. Next up, we have Materia, which was their first release on Peaceville Records, and it came out in 2006. Materia feels more explorative than any of their previous albums, and it's rather refreshing. Carmelo sounds like a much more focused singer, and the songs feel a bit heavier. This is due in part to the more modern sonic qualities presented on this record and what sounds to me to be new lower guitar tuning. I'm guessing that they probably went from 6 strings to 7 strings and added in a low B or an A or something like that. So their 80s new wave influences really come through on this album, with original songs like Comedia and the cover of Arcadia's The Promise. The album cover features another piece of a work by Travis Smith, and it's amazing, with the child walking towards a decrepit-looking city looming in the distance. It's very cool symbolism, and I love how it ties into the overall mood of the album. Here's a clip from that track I was talking about, Comedia. Take you by the hand and leave this place without a face. So for Timelessness, I gave this a 7. There are some great songs in this record, and it has its own feel and atmosphere. It's not usually one that I find myself returning to, but after revisiting this album for this video, I'm surprised that I hadn't put it in higher regard until now. That's one of the things that I loved about doing these discography rankings. I revisit albums that I had previously thought were average or below average and realize how much I really enjoy them. This is one of those records. Innovation gets an 8. This album gets some extra points in the innovation category simply because it doesn't sound like anything else that had been released by Novembre up until this point. It's unique and it stands apart from previous records, which I think is a great thing. For awesome songs, I gave it a 7 for a total score of Materia to be put at 22. Next up is The Blue, released in 2007 on Peaceville Records. Coming right off the heels of Materia, The Blue almost feels like an extension of that album. The sonic qualities match almost exactly up to Materia, which makes sense because they recorded in the same studios, and the songwriting features all of the Novembre tropes that you should come to know and expect if you've gotten this far in their discography. There's something in the way that Novembre writes their songs that even if you don't like the first half or so of a song, you just gotta wait, because the best part is hidden 3/4 of the way through or towards the end of the song. This album is full of those gems. Before we get to my scores, here's a clip featuring some beautiful female vocals on the song Nascence. So for Timelessness, I gave this record an 8. This might be one of my favorite Novembre records in terms of flow, pacing, and arrangement. It also contains a lot of unexpected moments of really attaching to a song and realizing, holy crap, the ends definitely justify the means on this track. Sometimes it can take them a while to kind of get where they're going, but when they get there, it really hits home. And this album does that in spades. For innovation, I gave this album a 6. A lot of the material on this record feels very similar to Novembre's records of the past. Coming off of the heels of Materia, though, which was a very innovative record for this band, I have to give them a little extra love than I otherwise might. And for awesome songs, I gave them a 10. So total score for The Blue is 24. And finally, we are at the end of the discography here with URSA, released 2016 on Peaceville Records. 2016 marked the longest time between Novembre albums. It was almost 10 years since the band had put something out until that. Prior to that, they were releasing albums quite regularly, as you had seen. This is the first album since the band's inception without brother and founding member Giuseppe Orlando. Still, the album feels cohesive, dreamy. It contains all the DNA that Novembre fans have come to know and expect and love, hopefully. I love their throwbacks to new wave music from the 80s on tracks like Oceans of Afternoon and Bremen. Their total Joy Division, Depeche Mode worship, mixed in with some of that heavy Gothic flair. Here's a clip from their official video from the song Ana Luce. And that track is such an upbeat banger and really reminds me of their Novembre and Waltz era. I love it. Let's get to the scores. timelessness on this record. There's just something about this album that helps it to stand out from their entire discography. After 22 years of honing their craft, Novembre has put out consistently good material, and their talent levels have only gotten more focused. URSA feels like a strong culmination of timeless songwriting and talented musicianship. Innovation gets an 8. There are definite songwriting innovations to take note of on this record, like the Eastern European folk direction of the song Agatha. It feels very fresh and well thought out. The production feels very modern, and it's what I expect to hear from a modern Gothic metal band. For Awesome Songs, I gave it a 9 for a total score of 25. Here are my overall thoughts on Novembre after having just sat with their discography over the last few days. Novembre isn't a band that has a ton of tricks up their sleeves. When you've heard a few of their albums, you begin to pick up their signature characteristics rather quickly. This is quite common for bands that feature one or two main songwriters, which this band does. Actually, you can take a look at the chart here that I found off of Wikipedia, and you can see that there have been a lot of members who have come and gone in the bass, the lead guitar categories, yet the 2 or 3 founding members of the band have really just kind of carried the signature characteristics of the band, which I think is fantastic. What I love about this band is how consistently good they are at delivering these tropes, these characteristics, these signature sounds. Even the lowest scoring album on this list is going to have some real gems. Therefore, I can't really discredit any of their records simply due to Novembre's ability to push out great music. They're also very talented musicians, and the bass players that they get in the studio are always superb. I love when a band puts a very talented bass player in that slot and lets them do their own thing. It really adds to the dynamic of the music, pushes it into that prog sort of level. And the vocals, on the other hand, Carmelo isn't the best clean singer I've ever heard, so I don't mind that they hide his imperfections with a lot of effects. It only adds to that dreamy atmosphere that they're going for. So thanks for watching so far. Brandon and I are trying really hard to keep this channel entertaining and as a resource for you. We have other video segments. If you haven't checked out Albums of the Year coming out, we have Underground Spotlights covering other bands. Go over to our playlist to see things in a more organized fashion, and let's get to the rankings. So, from bottom to top, we have Arte Novacento with a score of 15. Dreams Desure and Wish I Could Dream It Again, I just kind of combined those. That score gets 17. The album Classica gets a score of 20. Materia gets a score of 22. And for the top 3 albums, I have The Blue ranked at 24, URSA ranked at 25, and Novembre and Waltz ranked at 27. Not really surprised as to how that kind of panned out, but what do you think? What do you think of Novembre? What do you think of this ranking list? If you haven't heard them, does this video intrigue you enough to check them out? Definitely leave a comment below. Hit us up on social media. Thanks for watching. Go with the gods and forge on.